There we go.
We're good?
Right now, yes.
All right. Good evening and welcome again. Welcome to the premiere episode of Brothers Y'all Good. This is a podcast that we've been thinking about, dreaming about, praying about for some time. It's a podcast that's designed to have real conversations, create a safe space for those conversations, and really share some information, some insight, and some education. And so I'm happy to be here on this. My name is Mike. I'm here with my brother Jason and my sister Elizabeth, and we're going to talk about what we can do with Black men's mental health. So Jason, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what this podcast is really all about?
Right on. What's up, everybody? My name is Jason, and I'm happy to co-host this incredible podcast with my buddy Mike and my sister, Dr. Elizabeth Stanton. And Brothers Y'all Good is more than just a podcast. Actually, it's a real talk space where Black men can come through, open up, and get honest about mental health. This show dives deep into the stuff that matters: faith, fatherhood, fellowship, and all the ups and downs of navigating life as a Black man today. From dealing with stress, anxiety, and trauma, to breaking through the stigma that's been holding us back, this podcast keeps it real with personal stories, expert advice, and practical tools to help you find peace and strength. But this ain't just talk. It's about building each other up, sharing experiences, and creating a healthier, stronger community. So we just want you to pull up, tune in, and let's have the conversations that heal. Together, we're breaking the silence, overcoming barriers, and helping every brother to be able to say, yeah, brother, I'm good. And so we're happy to be here tonight. As Mike said, we're joined by Dr. Elizabeth Stanton, who happens to be my baby sister, one of the smartest people that I know. And so Dr. Stanton, if you want to say a few words of intro for yourself. Are you on mute? Uh-oh.
Okay, there we go. I won't say too much, and clearly I wasn't saying much at all, but you introduced me. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Stanton. I'm a clinical psychologist practicing in San Diego, and just looking forward to being able to shed a little bit of insight on what I know to the situation. And Jason, you might need more friends if I'm the smartest.
No, I don't need no more. I'm good.
But thank you.
Yeah, I don't need no more.
Jason got plenty of friends. That's not a problem. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here and what we're going to talk about. We in planning for this program, we decided that we were going to start by taking a really serious topic, and that's Black male suicide. It's a topic that is plaguing our community and our country, and one that we haven't really been discussing much before. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that. I wanted to share some statistics that I found out about where we stand as Black men and what's going on with us. And so one of the things that's true is, as a people, we don't have the highest suicide rate of any minority group. We're actually kind of in the middle. But the thing that you find when you look a little bit deeper is, if you're checking out Black men, our suicide rate is 4 times what it is for our Black sisters. Now, we could say part of that's got to do some with racism. Well, that's okay, right? But they're Black as well, and they are not taking their lives at the rate that we're taking ours. So part of the challenge is to figure out what is it that we're doing, why we're doing those things, and how we can change those behaviors and those cultures that we've developed over time that make it okay for Black men to decide for themselves, instead of trying to deal with my problems, deal with the world, deal with my coworkers, my significant others, or for my family members, that I'm going to take my own life. And so we're going to do that in a way that hopefully helps you have some information. We're going to encourage all of you to reach out to us either through Facebook or YouTube when we later post there, to let us know what you think about this conversation and how you think we can help move this along. One of the things that I know from my life, and I've talked to Dr. Stanton, Dr. Liz, and Jason about this, is God is so much a part of our lives, and that's part of what anchors us. So part of this conversation is going to include discussions about our Lord and Savior and how God has impacted our life, because we can't be authentic, we can't be real if we're not talking about those things. One of the other things that we're going to do in the upcoming episodes is we're going to invite people to come in. We've already been in contact with a number of people in the community here to get their interest in what's going on with Black men's mental health. And so we've got some people lined up that you're going to see in the weeks and months to come that are going to share their stories, their perspectives, and their advice. So although we've got Dr. Liz on this episode, she probably won't be with us on all of them, but we'll have other therapists and counselors that'll come in and share their stories with you, because we want this to be a space where you get a variety of perspectives. What Jason and I want to make sure everybody knows is we're not mental health experts. That's not our education background. But we have an interest and passion in the topic because of who we are and what we have to deal with. So we're going to share some of our stories. We're going to dive deeper into the stories of other people so you can get some clues about how you might be able to handle the challenges that you face. Jason?
Yeah, that's good, Mike. Thank you for that. You know, it's interesting as we're talking about a topic to talk about tonight, and it's interesting. You mentioned that suicide. You wanted suicide to be the first topic that we discussed, and I'll tell you, I've been struggling with that for the whole week ever since you talked about wanting this to be our initial topic. And the reason why, I think because even mentally it's still stigmatized to me. I think there's still a reluctance on my part to talk about something like this, because I know some people that have been affected by suicide in the Black community. I know some people personally. I've heard of other people. I know people that have been affected by suicide just in general, based on what I do for my line of work. I've seen the aftermath of when people decide to make that final decision. And I know other people have as well. And part of the hope of discussions like this, we want to normalize the discussion, destigmatize it, but we also want to decrease the instances of this in our community. And one of the ways that we're going to be able to do that is to just have regular conversations and to bring it up. And so I'm curious, Mike, why was this a topic that you felt was so important in the beginning?
And I appreciate that, Jason. And I really didn't at first. I thought it was going to be more general. And then, I prayed a lot about what this podcast and this program is designed to be and what my role in it's supposed to be. And one of the things that God showed me was, you are here, Mike, because I want you to be part of the hard conversations. And to your point, Jason, there probably isn't a harder conversation we can have about Black mental health than talking about people taking their own lives. And so it's a hard place to start. I recognize it, but God helped me understand that if we can really engage that and model for others what that engagement looks like, then it might be easier for other folks to have those conversations. And so one of the things that I'm happy to share, I had a dear friend, a fraternity brother of mine who, well, it still seems very recent to me, but it's been a while now. We're struggling with some things that I knew a little bit about, but I didn't know enough about. And the next thing you know, I was getting a notice from friends by text message on Facebook saying, hey, did you hear what happened to? And I was like, no, I hadn't. And part of what God helped me understand was that was somebody that God had put in my life, somebody that I had been in contact with, but I hadn't stayed in contact with. And not that I have that survivor's guilt that if I had only stayed in contact with him, he'd still be around. But what God helped me see was you can't say you did everything to make sure he knew where you stood with him. And so one of the things that happened after that is you would call me, Jason, and you would check in with me. Hey, my brother, I just want to see how you're doing. I'm just checking in with you. Not because there was some event coming up, not because you needed anything from me. I just wanted to check in. And God helped me see how important that was. God helped me understand what it meant to me, right? Not that I was having so much trouble that I was struggling getting through the day, but I recognized the value of, man, there's a brother out there that's checking in on me, that wants to take the time to sit for, and we joke when we talk to other people, the phone calls weren't 20-minute phone calls of, hey, let's see what's up. Those were 2-hour, 3-hour, 4-hour phone calls where we said to each other 4 or 5 times, well, I'm going to let you go because I know you're busy. And then we'd stay on the phone for another hour because another topic would tip off. And so it was those types of conversations that I got to understand the value of that. And so it was part of that that helped me understand if I could talk to other people about that. And so I thought about doing a podcast a year or more ago, but not about Black men's mental health. It was going to be about the stuff that I knew more about, the stuff that I went to school for, right? It was going to be related to the law. And God said, nah, not so much. Why don't you talk about the stuff that matters to me and my children? And why don't you help them with that? There's a lot of people that are willing to have that conversation about the law right now. You can find a lot of podcasts and other people trying to promote themselves to talk about, let me give you some legal advice. Let me explain how the system works. But he didn't show me a lot of people that were having the conversations that we want to strive to have. And so what God often does for me is he puts me in the places where there's already a void and says, fill the void. That's why I raised you the way I did. That's why I gave you the gifts that I gave you. Do that thing. And so you and I talked the end of 2023 about the fact that I was getting to that point in my life in my early 60s where I was comfortable with my voice, that I was willing to be a more active member of the community and go out and talk to people, to touch people, to check in with people, to see how folks were doing. And I realized if I could do that privately, that there certainly would be a benefit to do that publicly. And so that's part of what this is designed to be, is an example for other folks not to have to tune in every Tuesday to watch us, but to realize that in their lives, there's probably some brothers that they're cool with, that they haven't checked in with. You know, the phrase we use oftentimes in the community is, man, it's been a minute, right? When's the last time you talked to so-and-so? Oh, it's been a minute. And what the death of my fraternity brother showed me was, man, those minutes pass quickly. And so when people are gone, they are really gone. There are no do-overs. There's no, well, God, you see what had happened was, right? And so I want to help stress to people how important it is when you see that brother to really check in with them. That's kind of how the title of the podcast came about. Brothers, y'all good? Because I want to really find out, if you're not good, I might be in a position to help you in some way. And sometimes it's just sitting next to somebody, right? Sometimes it's going to dinner with somebody, going to a game with somebody, and just let me just chill with you. So that's what this is all about.
You know, I want to bring you in, Doc, and kind of along the lines of, Mike, you had talked about in the 2023 when we were talking about your desire to be more in the community. And that brought up something right now that I maybe you could touch on, Doc, and that is, you got stuff going on, and just because of the profession that you're in, and there's a certain way that you're supposed to, behave and carry yourself and all that, because of your position, doesn't leave you a lot of room to probably be able to publicly hurt, publicly confess what's going on with yourself. And so you carry a lot of that stuff. Liz, I want to know from you, like, kind of, I guess, really just what are some of your thoughts just about, from a clinical perspective, from a psychological perspective, what are some of the things when you start thinking about suicide, what are some of the things that you think about?
Do you mean things that I think about, or like things that I would look for, or like things that
yeah, just what comes up for you as a doctor? Like, say you're, when you meet somebody who you're going to talk to them as a psychologist about that. How do you how do you prepare for that with them? You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting that, Mike, you kind of led us with the idea that checking in, right, can make a really big difference in someone's life, and having connection with other people. And that's actually one of the stages of suicide, is when a person begins to disconnect, right? And so there's first, the psychological pain that might lead to the hopelessness, right? And that's where, for some of us who may believe in a higher power or something that gives us hope, that's one of the mediators to that type of risk, right? But the thing that would come to mind in terms of connectedness is, like, first, if I was going to see a person, my first concern would be, are they isolated, right? Do they have connection to other people? Is their family nearby? Are they able to call and connect with those people? Are they aware, of their, mental state at the moment, and able to make a connection with another person? Because that's the biggest thing, is isolation. And once a person is isolated, and then they become, really just a victim, in the case of suicide, to their thought, right? Their thought process, and maybe a pattern of thoughts that have led them down a trail to believe that there's no hope at the end of that trail. So I think that would be the first thing, is, are they connected? And then thinking about the way that they see life, right? What's their life perspective at this moment? And for many people, unfortunately, caused by a variety of reasons, but I think a big push for troubles, and when it comes to challenges with depression, etc., we're encouraged even by, like, COVID, right? In the pandemic, and people are at home, people are alone, people were isolated. And so when people are disconnected, it can definitely cause that sort of pattern to kick off. And then they begin to, again, just sort of become victim to their thoughts that life is not going to be any good. This is never going to change, right? Sometimes we need that person to be like, remember this and remember that, or just to give us hope about the future. And so as someone gets into that spiral, or maybe even they've experienced, right? Again, going back to all the way to COVID, life was rough. People lost their jobs. Things became very challenging economically, and then in relationships, right? People were at home together all the time. Stuff fell apart between people, etc. Not to keep using that as an example, but just, something that I think has encouraged the experience of people. Increased the experience of people now. But we as human beings have a need to, or we're not a need, but we're conditioned to avoid things that cause us pain, right? We're conditioned to avoid things that are uncomfortable. So one other piece that I would think about in interacting with someone is, have they become so hopeless, right? Or has their life become so painful? Maybe they can't ever find a job, right? That every time I try to take one step forward, I take 10 steps back. And having that experience repeatedly would essentially make living, right, something that you could almost say that naturally a person would want to avoid if they begin to experience that much pain based on their life. So back to, like, Black men, I think that that has a connection to that, right? Just as the man experience is the provider, right? Being able to take traditionally, right? Not necessarily all the time, but being able to, and not just provide for your family, because some people don't have a family, but be able to provide for yourself, right? Not to have to depend on other people for your livelihood. And if a person is experiencing that over and over and over and over and over again, perhaps that would encourage their depression that no one talks about. Going back to that too, right? The same thing. And then that depression can keep that spiral off.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about isolation, thought processes, patterns, um, it, and it kind of made me, um, it kind of led me to think about how times were back in the day with, say, like my father or like some of the gentlemen that are like a little older that had to depend on each other more than what folks have to really now. Like, and I don't mean to say, you know, segregation was necessarily a good thing, right? Like that's not necessary, but I think in some ways it was, in that we had to depend on one another. People weren't so bootstrapish, you know, taking on this American identity that everybody has to get whatever they get, however they got to get it. But where are you going to get it from? It's like, where are you going to, like, where do we get those things from? And then, so now we're kind of in this thing. If you kind of look at maybe the way some of the personality in, at least from my perspective, my worldview is based on like what is right here for the most part. Because wherever I visit, right, you visit somewhere and typically it's the tourist places. You might, you know, wander off and go, but you're not spending long amounts of time. You know what I mean? And so even if you travel the whole world, unless you've lived there for a long time and you've got to see people in their good days and bad days, you don't really know the personality of the place, right? Like if somebody comes to visit me, you ain't gonna know nothing about my life in 5 days. But, and I say all that to say that I think that as a people who lack a specific culture, and remember my context is kind of here, Western here, really, right? That's really what I'm speaking about. And if you ask people like, what is Black culture? Like, what does that actually mean? Like, you'd get a bunch of different answers or whatever. There's not and I understand that, you know, we're not a monolith, but I think what has happened is we've adopted. I remember growing up, and I don't know if I ever saw anybody Black ever, or knew anybody Black that ever committed suicide. I'm not saying it never happened. Right. And maybe some could say maybe you did it from drugs or some other way, like slowly you did it. But for somebody to just make the decision, that's it, I'm done. I don't remember seeing that. And part of what I'm thinking is that we've adopted the culture, because I knew like Caucasians that did it when I was growing up. I know that was like, you know, that's one of them things in the Black community. You say, man, white folks do that. Black people don't do that, right? People don't never do that, right? And so I think what is happening in many instances is that we are taking on this identity and wearing clothes and shouldering things that don't belong in our community, and we don't know how to deal with them. And so we're seeing these spikes. And look at like young kids who, for some reason, just like they feel like even as a young kid that I've had too much. I can't, like bullying and things I was bullied as a child. Like I was bullied a lot, being light skinned, all that type of stuff, man. I mean, but I never once was like, it's over, it's too much. And I mean, I was clowned, but
you still get clowned
100%. But one of the things that has changed, and then I'll pass it off. One of the things that has changed, and I was talking to a gentleman about this the other day. What has changed in my life, and I think what becoming a man has did for me, all the stuff I grew up with, all the other things, the thing that has changed is my perspective. My perspective has changed, and my perspective has gotten wider. And over the years, I've seen how God has intervened in my life and helped me through some of the worst things I've ever been through in my life. And God has always been there. And so I've always had a sense of hope. And I think even the scripture says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And so hope, the way we typically define hope in the world is like, man, you coming over? Yeah, well, man, I sure hope you coming, right? But really it's a doubt. I'm doubting that you're going to do it, And I'm just hoping that maybe you will. But if you define the word biblically, hope really is an expected waiting. So if you expect me to, if you hope that I'm coming over for dinner, then when I show up, there should be a plate of food ready for me.
Right.
You can't be like, well, I didn't know you was coming. I was hoping you was coming. No, you wasn't hoping I was coming. So I think defining those terms and really looking and shifting the way that we view the world is something that needs to happen. And so there's so much that goes on in my mind why people lose hope. And it's really a tragic thing. And I'm hoping that at some point, and I know we won't solve it in this conversation, but I'm hoping at some point that some folks will change where they're deriving their hope from, so that when things go bad, people don't just abandon everything and then just give up. What's going through your mind, Mike? What's coming up for you?
Well, it's exactly the idea of hope, right? The thought that there are times for most of us that something goes wrong enough that you just go, wow, okay, this is really difficult to deal with. And I recognize, for me, I've been blessed in a lot of ways, but you and I've talked over the years. I've gone through some stuff that made me have to go seek some help because it was greater than what I knew I can handle on my own. Unfortunately, I had people around me, back to Dr. Liz's point, I wasn't isolated enough that I thought, let me just try to solve this on my own. And so what I'm thinking is, we often get into these conversations about the nostalgic view of how things used to be, right? I remember a time when Black families used to do this and Black families used to do that. And we used to meet up this way and the church was this, and right, whatever it was that was our base. And I recognize we're not ever going to go back to those days.
Sure.
And so what I hope to see is that we develop new strategies for the new reality, right? To figure out ways, how do we create some of the same feelings through different expressions? Because it won't be, well, I shouldn't say it won't be. I believe in a God that can do all things. So I can't say that God won't send everybody back to the church, because that's certainly possible. But it seems unlikely, to your point, Jason, because so many of us have decided that we want to chase the dominant culture, which is not our culture, that we recognize we're in the United States and we're a minority. But if we can live like the majority, then maybe we can get some measure of acceptance. And what comes from that is leaving a culture that was depressed and repressed by the dominant culture, but had its own strength and dynamic to it, to try to chase after a culture that will let us chase for a while, that will throw some crumbs our way and say, no, there's some positions. You guys can have some spots. You can get nice cars and live in nice neighborhoods, but it's not fully accepted by that culture, and you're not fully still a part of the culture that you were in before. And so you find yourself in this no person's land in between, and you don't have any of the cultural supports that help, right? I don't want this show to get political at all, but I make this observation. Our president-elect had the ability to galvanize people to come together to see him. That was something that they could embrace. They would stand in line to be a part of a community. And then he gave them a name, which is an acronym, and they were happy to wear the caps and embrace all of that, because it was not being isolated. It was being a sense of a community that was different than the political party community that they were a smaller subset of. So they were something that they could hold on to. And so what I know needs to happen is we need to create smaller enclaves of those types of opportunities for people, so they have something that they can hold on to. Everybody doesn't need to go to the same church that you and I go to. That's cool. But they need to have something where they get together and deal with their spiritual self, right? We talked earlier before we started the podcast. Not everybody needs to believe what we believe, but it's not going to change what we believe. And so we're going to talk some about that, but everybody's going to need to find for themselves where they fit in.
Right.
Because if you don't fit in, you're going to be left out.
Yeah.
When you get left out in this society now, in 2025, a society where smart people are sitting around every day trying to figure out how can we get machines to replace humans as workers. And so more and more people are going to find that there's fewer and fewer opportunities for them to find employment in the jobs that they grew up watching their grandparents and their parents hold, because we just won't need them anymore.
Yeah.
We're going to get to the point where the safest person to drive our kids to school will be the self-driving bus. It won't be a bus driver that we pay $60,000 a year to, because that we would have determined, we would have acquiesced to the people that have brains and money. Yeah, we can eliminate those jobs. I was talking to my wife tonight. She was at the store watching store employees watch customers use the automated cash registers.
Crazy.
And struggle and not realizing that they're literally watching their own jobs disappear.
Right. Right.
Because at some point the store is going to go, we don't need to have people watch people scan groceries anymore. People have figured out how to do that well enough on their own. We don't need you now. And we embrace all of that because we like technology and its advancement, and it makes perhaps our jobs and our lives easier. Unless you've got a friend or a family member that was their job. And now they don't have a job, because it's that type of finding a place for yourself. One of the things that I always impressed when I go to Africa is how they haven't decided to replace people with machines. So if you go to Africa, instead of somebody with a leaf blower who can efficiently blow off the leaves off the lawn in 2 minutes, there are 20 people with little brooms, and they're all sweeping.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, when you witness it, you go, man, that is a waste. They got all these people over here trying to do this. So you could do that so much easier if you got one of them big rakes from Home Depot and just raked all that stuff up. You could. But there's 20 people that are taking home a check that they're taking back to their family to support themselves so they can move forward. And so they feel connected.
Right.
They feel purpose, right? That's something that's so important, right? To feel a sense of purpose in your life. You know, my friend that's not here, that was one of the things he struggled with. As he was doing things that were giving him recognition, he questioned what his purpose was. Because once you've done the thing that people said you couldn't do, what more am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Can I take it to the next level? Can I do the next thing? Has it gotten too big for me? Right? Well, you hear they say that all the time about entrepreneurs that start businesses. The person that started the business isn't necessarily the person that needs to run it once it gets up and running and it is big. Well, if that was my business, then what do I do now?
Right.
You know, that's what Steve Jobs struggled with. Apple was my company until it wasn't. Until the people that he put on the board called him to a board meeting and said, you're not running this company anymore.
Mm.
And so it's those types of things, and it can happen with all of us, right? Mental health challenges don't know any demographics. It doesn't matter how much or how little money you have. Those things that bother us as humans bother us as humans. And so whether it's outside stuff, whether it's our own health and our health care system isn't helpful to dealing with some of those problems. And so some people find themselves in huge debt because of what's going on. We've got the fires just up the road in Los Angeles. And what no one's really talking about yet is the mental health counseling for those people that are living through that devastation. Because one of the things that's going to happen for some of them, for many of them that have already been on the news, is I lost everything and insurance is not going to cover this because State Farm pulled out from wildfire insurance in 2023. And so some people who thought that they were living their best life are watching people set up GoFundMe pages to try to help them get back on their feet. And what I know to be true is not everybody's going to make it. Some folks are going to say, you know what? I can't start from scratch at this age. Whether they're in their 30s or in their 50s or in their 70s, they're going to say, it's been enough. They took everything I had. The battle's too much for me. And there's no group that they get to hang with. Because even though they all went through the fire, they're not part of some special club where they're going to meet up every Tuesday and talk about what they're going through. Everybody's going through the same crisis. It's like the pandemic. I appreciate you bringing that up, Dr. Liz, because it's everybody going through the same crisis at the same time individually. So what the pandemic meant for some people was very different than what it meant for others. For some people, that meant I got family members that are constantly in and out of the hospital. I got family members that I'm burying that I can't go to the funeral to. Now, other folks were like, man, this is just an inconvenience because I need my store back open so I can make my money. So I'm not sick. My friends aren't sick. Let's go. Let the healthy people do what healthy people do and let the sick people take care of themselves. So we were going through the same thing differently. And a lot of people never made it through that because they just struggled being able to reach out to somebody, because I think it's hard when you look around and other people are going through the same problem. You know, I think that's what makes it hard for us sometimes as Black men. We don't want to talk about what might have happened to us in our relationship or at work because the people that we would complain to are going through the same stuff.
Well, let me you brought up a few really good things, and what you just landed on right now, I think is something I think is worth spending some time on. And Doc, I'm curious from you, because a lot of the things you talked about, Mike, were things happen and then the adjustments are made to the brain. Stuff happens and then it implements something in the brain, right? Something happens where a person goes from, you look at a child that's learning to walk. And if a child did what a lot of adults do, they would never, they would never learn to walk because it's painful. However, if you look at the way babies are designed, they're designed to be able to fall and to do that's, they're actually designed that way. So Doc, what I'm curious about just is some of the brain stuff that happens around depression. What are some of the things that happens when a person is depressed? And we want to be mindful of time, but I want to spend some time on this right here, Doc. If you could just talk about that. What happens in the brain when someone gets depressed?
Well, essentially, when we start to become depressed, that experience deprives us from the neurotransmitters that keep us from being depressed, if that makes sense, right? Like kind of like that, the food that we need, the brain food that we need to keep us to keep us in a place where we're able to endure life. So, right. So if, again, then there's a lot of different factors. It could be genetics. It could be a personality challenge that a person has, right? That they're just they have like a predisposition for depression. And some people are just born that way. Maybe you have parents who were depressed when you were a child. So you watch them respond to life in a depressive manner. So you might, tend to experience life in that way. But then also it could be that we have a way of shaping our experiences and then interpreting them a certain way. So in other words, like our perspective, our worldview, and the way we see ourselves in our world has a lot to do with how the depression can begin. And it can be one experience, right? It could be something small as, an argument, in a relationship, or a constant, or losing a relationship or something like that. But it could even be as big as, losing a job or having some other big life challenge that comes into play. And so the way we respond to that and the way we think about that is really important. And if we spiral into negative self-thoughts and thinking that, it's never going to change and it's going to be all bad all the time. And on that same note, words matter, right? The words that we use when we talk about things, if it's doom and gloom. I was speaking with a person recently, and they were given notice that they're going to have to move, right? And anybody who's gets a notice like that these days, you're like, oh my goodness, because the rental rates are, sky high. And if you have a family, there's definitely some challenges. And in talking about, well, it was like, well, come the date, say it was, May, come May, we're not going to have any place to live. That sounds really bad, right? Instead of like, I have until May to find a place to live.
Right.
Totally different, right? So in that same vein, like if we're experiencing things kind of on that same note, right? Like I'm not going to have anywhere to live. This is happening. We're like victimizing ourselves because life is going to do life, right? Life is just going to happen. And then we just have to live through it. So as I was listening to you, Mike, I was thinking, and as Jason, you kind of summed it up about like people sort of kind of having these responses to life and these challenges. And I thought of, and also kind of the difference in the generations. That's what got my brain thinking about this at first. And I think that it's also a matter of psychological toughness, right? And that's a concept that you could say it's like a personality trait, but I don't think it's necessarily something you have to be born with. I mean, I think you can be conditioned and learn to have a sense of psychological toughness. And I think that depending on the way you were parented, right, that will have a lot of impact on your psychological toughness. And if we have a generation that doesn't experience toughness as much, then that could be a problem, right? So considering even just the ease of information, right? No one, but especially, the younger generation doesn't have to work hard to get information, right? We don't have to try for that. We get it easily. You got an award because you earned an award, right? If you were a good student, you got an award. And then all of a sudden, everybody's feelings were hurt. And then it was like, okay, my kid, right, deserves an award. And I would argue, this is just me being silly and facetious, not clinically, but I would just argue in a silly way, but maybe I think the generation before now that was a part of the generation where you had to earn your your status, or, you had to earn your award, perhaps. I think those are the parents that then had children and they blocked their child's ability to even develop toughness because they zeroed in and was like, you better give my child an award for coming to school or doing something, living through their own experience of whatever that was when they were a child, right? So you have this kind of perpetual. And then when we treat children like that, even something as small as everybody's going to get a reward or an award, I'm sorry. You don't even have to do anything, right? Even if there's graduations now, like you will get a you get a diploma for attendance. Like, and in some instances with people with mental challenges, or, like kind of developmental challenges, makes sense. But if we are creating a generation like that, that doesn't work in the real world. So to your point, Mike, so yeah, we have a lot of people who have a false sense of the economy, right? Like, oh, there's jobs out there. If I apply, I'll get a job. I'll get a job. And while that's true, that's always been true. That was true when I was getting a job, right? That experience hasn't changed, but I think what's changed is perhaps some of that toughness that sees us through those experiences, right? That sees us beyond, like sees us through just, well, I applied to 100 jobs on Indeed. Well, okay, right? You know what I mean? But it's, so I think that like in being able to, you got to go out and you got to try, and like somebody you could say, for instance, who applied, maybe to 100 jobs in Indeed, and they're just waiting for somebody to give them a job. They might have experience as a child, their parents doing some of their hard tasks, right? that late night project, that homework, that whatever. And like, so they don't always have an ability to respond to that. So to kind of bring this all the way back, as we have these moments of challenge in life, and what we did as children, or maybe what might have worked for us in those moments, that life doesn't work like that now when you're an adult. And then those challenges perhaps can lead to the depression, that can then lead to the hopelessness, that can lead to the suicidal ideation, and essentially a person really feeling like it would be better for me and everyone around me if I wasn't here anymore.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that, Doc. And I think one of the things that's true, and I see the message up there from Eric. One of the things that's so amazing is that generation that you talked about that raised the kids that were all going to get participation trophies also worked really hard to insulate those kids from their parents' pain, right? Those are parents that went through pain and not only wanted to not pass that on to their kids, so they worked really hard so their kids didn't experience the pain, but they also worked really hard to not talk about their own pain in front of their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so those kids, many of them didn't learn that you needed some toughness, some grit to get through tough times, because they never saw or heard their parents talk about tough times and how they got through them. Those are parents that worked really hard, and some of those parents are from my generation, worked really hard to make it look like, to borrow the famous TV family, we're the Huxtables, right? Everything's good. There's nothing to look at here that's going to be problematic. We are so good. You are a blessed child. We are good. You know what? I'm going to go talk to your teacher because you should have got a higher grade. I agree with you, right? In my day, that would have never been the thing. I can't even imagine my mother going to advocate on my behalf to my teacher, not that they misscored my exam, but given my score, I should get a different grade. My mom would be like, hey, you should have got more points. And so I think we lost that connection between, if I can see somebody around me getting through stuff, then I can learn to get through stuff. And so by teaching those kids, some of them who are now adults trying to decide for themselves, do they want to have kids for their own? And some of them don't, in part because the job of adulting seems really hard already. And why do I want to take on the job of parenting? Because parenting seems to be, I've got to make sure that my kid never faces anything harmful, because that's what my parents tried to do for me. So we've created this system that doesn't seem to work. And for Black men, we've just created a system where we're just not going to talk about stuff that goes wrong for us. We just refuse to. We're just not going to. And so part of what I'm glad this space is going to be available. I appreciate Greg logging in with his comments about this, because we need to talk about what's really going on. You know, part of the logo is real talk, because we need to have real conversations about what are we doing as Black men? What can we do better? And so one of my questions for you, Dr. Liz, is how often, I appreciate that, Anthony. Yeah, no, you can keep the trophy on the mantle. But how often or how little interaction does it take? I'm having trouble with it. Let me try it this way. At what point would you be concerned if someone was depressed with how much interaction they were having with loved ones around them that was helpful to them? Would it be what types of markers are you looking for as a clinician in that regard?
There's a lot of variables that go into that, right? If they have a safe, for instance, a healthy family, support system, then even being able to connect to people by phone is helpful, right? Or being able to reach out. So I think it's tricky because also with social media today and people connecting on the internet, even though those people seem like they're really isolated, we see some people in their dark room and they've been on the internet playing games for hours. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're isolated because they're connecting with people in a different way, like, using the internet. So again, as long as the people are connecting in some way, and it also depends on the person. Some people need to have that social connection, and that's what's really going to make a difference. A phone call, not to say it's not helpful, but it may be that they need a little bit more than that on an ongoing basis than just a check-in. But I think at the very least, being able to connect in some way with another human being can be helpful if the person isn't harmful.
Right, because we hear things, and I read things. My wife teases me. I'm always trying to do some internet research on my phone, right, to find out more about these topics, to make us more productive, more well-rounded, healthier, more grounded. They say things like the average person needs 8 hugs per day. I'm just wondering, does it matter how the interaction is? You were mentioning people that some folks more now than ever spend time on devices, and that's how they communicate with people, myself included. My wife always teases me, and she's like, "Did you talk to your kids?" It's like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Oh, well, what did so and so say?" I was like, "Well, we were just texting." And she's like, "Oh, well, you weren't really talking to her then." I was like, "No, we were having a conversation." But is that a significant difference between not just in person, but picking up old school phone, right? Using my phone as a phone rather than a device to connect through social media.
Right.
Is there a difference in how that helps us, to our soul, to our spirit, to our mental health, feel grounded?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it can. I would argue that even for a younger generation, or for the younger generation, that direct communication via phone, hearing someone's voice, picking up the phone, or seeing them in person has a bit more impact, but it doesn't take away, again, the connection that can be made using a text message. It just, again, depends on the person receiving it, right? Is that their preferred way of communication? I have some patients that open up a lot more when we're on the phone than they do when we're in person. So, right. So if it's going to be better for them to talk about a challenging issue and over the phone, then that's how we'll do it. Right. So that they, but so I think I know I keep saying like it depends, but it's just kind of on the person. But I do want to say this, and in consideration of, before we run out of time, that rather than I think it's important to think about and consider, what does a person need? How much connection and interaction do we need with a person? And maybe when do we gauge when someone's in trouble? And so to answer that directly, maybe when there's been a shift or a decrease in however they normally communicate, right? You see somebody on Facebook all the time. All of a sudden you don't. You might pick up the phone, check them out, see how they're doing, right? Maybe you used to see them at church every week. Now you don't, right? If there's been a shift in how they normally interact, maybe you text somebody on a regular basis and you find they're not responding, then, instead of assuming that someone's busy, maybe we take the assumption that maybe they need a different type of connection, perhaps. But also, instead of maybe thinking of it of like, what do we look for in the other person, maybe in a like a preventive, progressive way, and with the theme of, checking in with folks, maybe it's more of a challenge to thyself, right? Rather than trying to figure out all the people in our circle and are they okay? Right. Maybe it's a challenge to check in with other people, right? To check in and, just make a point. Let me, who haven't I talked to in a while, right? And to just kind of make that a thing that you do, so that maybe we can slowly but surely get back to the way that things were before, where, like you were saying, Jason, we are more dependent on, where we could be maybe more dependent on one another for things we need or for success or anything like that. I think that was what you said. But and so that's important, because again, we've sort of diminished or separated, and that's, I don't know, kind of naturally, but slowly but surely we've come to that. And then you could even argue too, culturally, right? In the land, that's not how we're supposed to be. And if we're thinking about how we're made, right? We're created to be in relationship with one another. So as we slowly but surely begin to, detach from people, that's an issue. But the way to do that isn't, hey, you should call me more, right? Let's just check in with folks. Maybe when you're out in public, speak to a person, right? If you're normally someone who wouldn't, or you talk to them, just say, hello, how you doing today? Nice hair.
Can I, you reminded me of something, Doc, and all of this. And actually it was, when you just mentioned this, Anthony, today, I was sharing with my therapist. I go to therapy. I was going once a week, but now we started doing twice a month. I was talking to my therapist, and I was sharing the same experience I was sharing with you, Doc. I call my sister Elsie, so it's weird to call her Doc. I don't call her that, but publicly I call her Doc because I want people to recognize that I know some smart people, and we from the same womb. But I was sharing with my therapist the same thing I shared with you, Elsie, about we dropped my daughter off for college last week, and today, about an hour and 20 minutes, about an hour and a half ago or whatever, we pulled away to go to the airport to leave her at college. And this was the first time that she's been away from home that was going to be an extended amount of time. And this is a kid that don't like, well, she's not a kid. She's my baby. She's an absolute adult, but this is the one that didn't want to spend the night nowhere. I mean, Marla, my wife, didn't sleep very well when Naya went to stay the night places because she would call and I want to come home. My point is, everything, at least I thought, was good. And this kind of goes to what you were asking about, Anthony. Everything was good until I went to hug her goodbye. And as soon as I did that, I started crying. And it surprised me. And I was thinking to myself, what is happening right now? And you talk about that check-in, Anthony. As we were going to the airport, and while we were at the airport, as we're in the air, and even today, I'm asking myself, where did that come from? There was no sign that was, there was nothing. I still don't know. My therapist said, we'll talk about it next time. But from that conversation, we started talking about something else that I realized is an issue. And two things that have happened, and I want to ask about resources that are available, because I think that's one thing that people need is resource. But the other thing that my conversation with my therapist led into was me reinforcing my bad habits. She called it, she said part of what I got therapy notes. I'll be taking notes in my therapy, reinforcing my impulses. And one of the things that I tend to do, something will happen and I'll reinforce it with a behavior. My mind will say, hey, we need to get on social media. And every time I do that, there's a chemical that is released when I have this feeling or whatever. And you can tell me, Connie, if I'm tripping, Elsie, and then I reinforce it. I go pick my phone up. And what I'm telling my mind is, yeah, it's okay. Every time, we don't even got to push it. You gonna just do whatever, no matter what. You just gonna do it. And what I think has happened, again, is that over time, we have begun to pick up culture from people who don't have the culture that we've had in our community for a long time. And we started doing things that they do, individualism and rugged individualism too. I don't need nobody. So much so folks is making songs about it, and all these people, and we are, we wear clothes and all type of stuff, and everybody in the neighborhood know you ain't got no money. They know you ain't got no money. You ain't got no business having them shoes on, and that everybody knows you ain't got no money, but we all just ignore that stuff. And I think that we ignore the truth. And then if you say something about it, you're hating. Oh, you just being a hater. And it's no, it's true. I know that you don't have that kind of money. And what I think has happened over time is that we've just begun to adopt, as you said, Mike, the dominant culture. And we started becoming like the dominant culture. And that doesn't work in our culture. That does not work with a people that are really communal. So with that being said, even in my therapist, thank God I have a therapist that like she's wasn't born with a silver spoon, spoon in her mouth, and like she like understands cultural nuances and stuff. Um, but I think even when we go get help, and I think sometimes the help has adopted that culture. The people that teach us about the brain and whatever are people that have that culture. You know what I'm saying? And so, like, even our psychology, it seems like our psychologists or therapists just look at everything from a very Western lens. It seems like, how does a person, Elsie, like, what are some ways that people who may be struggling with depression, what are some, like, where would they go get help? Where are some, and even from just, hey, I think I need to go see somebody or whatever, how could somebody do that? But then also maybe if someone's in crisis right now and is willing to be honest with themselves that they're in crisis and they're willing to do something, what is something that they could do to help with that? Because, and one last thing is, because I have realized that what I've believed, a lot of the stuff I believed is a lie. And it robbed me. That lie has robbed me of the hope that belonged to me. But because I believed the lie, I became hopeless. And so, Elsie, what would a person do in that way?
So I think you make a great point about like the sort of the lie. So I think if we're trying to live beyond our means, right, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be that we're trying to live like another culture, because we're in America, right? We are a part of this culture. This is our culture. So I think that's one thing, right? Like, instead of making it a big distinction, because that's just too big, it's just, okay, we're here. So I think that's the one part, is to be able to be honest with yourself about kind of where you are, right? And that kind of goes into like what Anthony was saying about the check-in, to check in with our emotions regularly, and to kind of even be able to understand, what are we feeling, right? A lot of times people think they're angry and really they're sad. Their feelings are hurt. They're not mad. They're just upset. But I think being able to check in with yourself, and then in those moments kind of take some inventory about what's happening, and then apply that as you move forward. And that might mean that you check in with folks, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be this formal piece of going to a therapist, but even just having someone you can be accountable to and honest, that makes sense, can be helpful. That's just kind of a basic start. But if a person is in crisis and they find like, I'm not safe, right? I'm feeling like I want to hurt myself, and I'm thinking of different ways that I could do that. Perhaps, obviously the hospital is an option, but if a person wants to seek out the services of 988, pick up the phone and dial 988 instead of 911, and people will come to you to walk you through and kind of talk to you about what you're feeling and where you're at, not necessarily to haul you away to the hospital or anything, but just to be able to have a conversation and make sure that you're safe. So that's an option. And then you can always, if a person has insurance, there's typically a number on the back of the insurance card that'll say mental health or behavioral health services, and calling the number and saying, these are my demographics, this is kind of what I'm looking for. Some people want folks maybe who are faith-based, or maybe they want a male or a female, and they can share that information with the member service person, who will do the footwork even to like find some available providers in that person's network or close to them. And that's not always golden, right? Sometimes the people aren't accepting patients, etc. So I think another part of the process, if a person is just looking for some help, right, they're just kind of noticing, I kind of want to get some therapy, to be patient with that process, because it does take time to find the right person. But even before that, just to get on the phone and get scheduled with a person. So just not to give up on the process.
Yeah.
Right. And I appreciate that, because but it almost seems inconsistent, right? The person that gets to the point where they're finally, especially from our community, that finally decides, I'm going to reach out for some help, isn't the person that's willing to be patient as this takes some time to unfold. That's usually the person that thinks that they have some acute needs. And I know we talked about it a little bit before the podcast, and we're going to talk more about it in upcoming episodes, but just talk a little bit more briefly about 988 and how important that number is, because I know I was talking to some other people and they were like, wait, what? I didn't know there was a number that you could call to get help. Everybody has learned in the 30 years that the country's used 911 what that's designed to do. I call 911. I know that police or fire rescue are going to come to wherever I'm at, and they're going to try to take care of my situation. What are they going to do? What am I going to get if I pick up the phone and hit 988? Who's coming and what are they doing?
Typically, it's a person who has some training in crisis intervention, and it's a team of folks that, depending on the level of need, right, probably based on what the description of what the person's experiencing, they'll send a team of people out to the person's home to kind of meet them there. Because, right, if a person's in crisis, we don't want to say, well, go get in your car and drive over here so we can have a conversation. So they go to the person and have some dialogue in person, maybe get a gist of the scene. A big concern, right, is a person's access to, weapons or having a plan of how they're going to harm themselves. So depending on how far along a person is in that process, they may respond differently, right? They may decide that a person is so far in danger that they need to go to the hospital. And so then they would have a conversation. I mean, they would just lie to somebody. They would definitely, say, hey, what do you think? We're going to call the police and have them come and assess you to take you to the hospital. So they're able to make that call. But then also maybe they're just going to be there to walk you through. Because remember, we talked about isolation. Sometimes people have been alone and they're alone in those moments. And so having someone to talk it out, to maybe cry it out and get it out is relief. In relief enough that then they're not on maybe an 8 or a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 that they're going to hurt themselves. And that's, so it doesn't mean, again, that it's going to be the solution, but it can at least be sort of like a mobile emergency room, right? That they come to you, this crisis team comes to you and gets you situated. And maybe you have to stay at the hospital, right? Sometimes that's the emergency room approach. And sometimes you can, go to see your doctor later. And then that would be encouraged as well for that person to get connected with mental health services.
I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like going to that, sorry, just to touch on that, because it goes back to even Anthony's question. We have to be constantly checking in with ourselves, right? Which requires some honesty with ourselves about our feelings and maybe how we're being impacted by our environment. And so if we're constantly checking in with ourselves, we might catch it before it gets to this place, to that place where it's crisis, and maybe we can wait a couple weeks to get in touch with a mental health, like a psychologist or a therapist.
Right. Jason, why don't you talk a little bit about the page that you pulled up for 988 in Black mental health?
Yeah, I just typed in Black mental health resources, and 988 Lifeline came up, and there's some things here. They have community lean into community, ask for help, ask and listen. They have videos, they have statistics and other organizations that are available for people. Right here, some therapy for Black men. Right here, the National Organization for People of Color Against Suicide. I think that stuff like this, sometimes these types of resources are necessary in our community as we are looking for ways to take care of what is real. Because regardless of what has happened and regardless of how we got here, we're here. And we have to begin to do something. And if we recognize that there are problems, long wait times, maybe there's not something that we can necessarily do. We may not be able to overhaul the system now, right? We may not be able to do that. But I was on Channel 7 the other morning, and they talked about mental health. Well, they asked about mental health.
Right.
In my profession, the top 3 things that are killers in my profession are cancer, heart attack, and suicide. Those are the 3 things. And the last thing that I left them with is it's like, find somebody to talk to. If something's going on, find somebody to talk to. But what I thought about as a leader, even in my community and in my organization as a leader, I also need to make sure that I am somebody to talk to. And
Right.
so I think that that's important. And one of the things, and I've shared this a lot over the last 2 years, is that as I've gone through my pain and my struggle in my life and all the things that I've been through, I used to ask God for help. Like I want, like, give me somebody to talk to. I need to be able to hold somebody's hand and get through what I needed to, what was on my back, and it was too much. And what I've realized over the years is that God was not going to give me a hand to hold, but God was making me the hand to hold. And that's a big difference. And so I want to encourage somebody, some brother out here who just feels like it's too much. I got too much going on. It's too deep. I can't do it anymore. And I want to say, I don't know what you're going through. I have no idea what you're struggling with right now. But I want to tell you, yes, you absolutely can get through this. And you must. Because the person that you're looking for is the person that you may be becoming right now, so that somebody else can look for you. And it's important for you to be around. It's important for you to continue on. And I know that it seems like it's too much. And that's very real. That feeling of it's too much and getting that claustrophobia, and that's all I can think about, and the noise is too loud. I want to tell you, I've been there before. I know what that feels like. And what I want to encourage you, what I did, and it took some time, but it also took courage. It took courage. It took courage for me to think about in the past. You know, God always told her, and as Mike said, what I believe is what I believe, what you believe is what you, that's fine. But all I can do is talk about my experience and what I did. And I began to think about the monuments that I set up over time in my life, where God was showing me that the things that I'm going through is very purposeful. And I think what happens is we begin to shut out everything. I don't want to hear no noise, including the sounds of people who are telling me exactly what I need to hear. I don't want to hear nothing from no one. And so I began to make myself available. I began to say in a moment, I'm going to listen to somebody else. And what that did for me was that little bit of willingness to continue on, that bit of willingness gave me hope. And that hope lit a small fire, no pun intended, with all that's going on in California. But what we need to see is the analogy is that fire didn't start at 1,000 acres. That fire started really, really small, and it grew to be big because it had food to consume, and it began to consume everything. And before you know it, it began to create its own world, its own weather patterns. And fire does that. Big fires create their own weather patterns, and they do their own thing. And that's what hope looks like. Hope looks like one step, having just enough to maybe find that person to be able to say it, to be able to say something to. And the last thing I'll say, and that will give you hope. And the last thing I'll say is, for me, I went through rehab as a kid. And one of the things that I learned that was so powerful, and I've practiced it throughout my life, and I can say that it's true, is that I need to tell on myself. There are two things that are going on with people. Some things, people are depressed because of what has happened to them. That's one thing. And some people are depressed because of what they've done to people. And so what I want to encourage, and my hope and prayer for you, is that you'll find somebody that you can tell on yourself. The scripture says, confess your faults one to another, that you may be healed. There's something powerful about, and I'll never forget the time that I told my sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous, Timothy Huddleston, who was a father figure to me for a long time. And I remember the time when I had to tell him that I was struggling with pornography. And I was so embarrassed and shamed. I was younger, and so I was so ashamed. I didn't want to tell him. But I knew I had to have the courage to be able to say that. And when I said it, he was able to give me some advice. And truth is, sometimes your scenarios, other people be like, man, I actually had that same problem. That's not what he said to me, but his thing was like, it was okay. It's okay for you to tell on what's going on with you right now. So I want to encourage somebody out here today to find somebody you can talk to. And then I want to encourage other folks to become somebody that someone can talk to. Don't be quick to get on social media. Nothing. Don't share whatever somebody's saying. Just hold on to it. And you have to dance with somebody, but you don't have to dance with everybody. So as far as I'm concerned, I just want to, let's go around and just maybe like some closing thoughts. That's it for me. Mike, I'm good. Right. You're right. You're right, Greg. We can't tell everybody. Confession brings cleansing. That's what Greg said. And so I agree with that. So Mike, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, let's go to Dr. Liz next, and then I'll wrap up for us.
Doc, closing thoughts?
Well, I think that just in closing that maybe a challenge, or I should say an invitation for folks, is to consider how much time they spend on social media and what their social media is about, right? Like, is it jokes? Is it funny? Is it dark? Is it, what's kind of the common denominator for what we would say, maybe inundate ourselves with on a regular basis? And could that social media interaction be exchanged for in-person social interactions instead? Just
That's good.
I love that. Here's what I'm going to challenge people. I'm going to challenge people that this week do what Dr. Liz said. Look at your life and see if there's somebody whose social interaction pattern seems different at the beginning of this year. One of the things that Jason and I heard from our pastor this year is about new year, new me, right? And this is about getting to the starting line. And this is a chance to really shape a year that can be drastically different than the way we live 2024. And so I'm going to encourage everybody to find that somebody that you just haven't checked in with for a while, and call them out of the blue, or send them a text or email, something to reach and try to touch them just a little bit, to let them know that you're there and that you see them. One of the things my nonprofit used the Zulu word sawubona, which loosely means I see you, I love you, I respect you. It's the idea that people that feel seen feel connected, and people that don't feel seen disappear into their little dark spaces where people won't pay attention to them, and they gradually decide, well, then no one's going to miss me. And so we hope that, especially for the brothers out there, one of the statistics I wanted to close with was the second leading cause of death for Black men under the age of 25 is suicide. That's just crazy to me. Because that's just untapped potential from our princes and kings that we're depending on to provide for us, to sustain us, to interact with us, to push us to grow. And so those are the young men that I want to make sure that we keep. And so find somebody in your life that you haven't touched base with for a while and reach out to them. What I told Jason I was going to do before we ever started the podcast is, if it's going to be about my life now, it's got to be about God. And if it's going to be about God, then it's going to include prayer. And so I've been watching podcasts for the past 6 months. I haven't seen a bunch of folks that haven't called their podcast a Christian podcast that do prayer. But to me, I can't separate it out. So I'm going to go ahead and lead us to a closing prayer. We'll be back in touch with you in a week. We'll try to get some new guests in here for you. You'll be able to follow us on Facebook. The thing I'm going to say is, despite the fact that you might hear me or Jason or Dr. Liz say that over time, this is not about us trying to monetize anything for us. This is not a side hustle to get some YouTube dollars or Facebook ad money or anything like that. This is actually a labor of love and a labor of passion. So we're going to invite you to be a part of it. We're going to be here available for you to reach out to in between shows, to ask your questions, to share your comments, either through Jason's page on Facebook, my page on Facebook, or the Facebook group for Brothers Y'all Good. And so with that, If we can bow our heads, I'll go ahead and take us out in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to come before you in prayer. You say in your word that when 2 or more of us are gathered in your name, there you are in the midst. And certainly I can testify with my heart that you've been with us this entire podcast. I hope that the words that we've shared with each other and shared through the airways have made their way to some individuals that needed to hear a message that you had us primed to share to them, that they're not alone, that they can be connected. And if they're feeling good and fine and strong in their life, that they need to reach out and find someone else that they can connect with and make sure that person's good. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the life that you've given us. We recognize what a treasure it is to be given the breath of life. And we want to do whatever we can to take care of that wonderful treasure that you have for us. We ask that you put your hedge of protection around not just the 3 of us, but everyone that has a chance to listen to this podcast live or listen to it tape delayed, so that they can feel your love and your presence in their life and the support that they need. We ask for all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. And so with that, I appreciate you. Jason, you good?
I'm good.
All right. Liz, you good? She's frozen. I guess that means she's iceberg slim good.
Yeah. All right, cool.
And I'm good. Thank you both for allowing me to do this. We got it off the ground. Let's
go.
Let's see how it flies from here.
Thank you to everybody who watched, commented, shared it. We really appreciate y'all. We just said we're going to get it going. That's what we did. It'll get better and get greater. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
All right. We out.